is Matt doing Teach U.S. Kids to Program. Thanks, Matt.
I'm sorry. So this is kind of an open-ended discussion. I mean, I'd like to say kind of discussion, for the end, but I think this is an interesting crowd to present to just because there's so many people from all kinds of different backgrounds, but all sharing a love for technology, and in this case, I'm kind of focused on Apple II computer because that's what I grew up here with. So, kind of to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about, first I'm going to touch on why this issue should even matter to you, give you a little bit about my background, tell you some of my concerns, give you a little bit of propaganda. I'm going to show a short YouTube video, discuss some possible solutions, and this is the kind of thing that I'm open to discussion on. I'm not sure exactly what the solutions are, so I'm just going to throw out there some ideas I have, and then wrap things up. So why it matters. Right now, I mean, unless you're kind of been under a rock, the U.S., you probably know the U.S. is trailing in technology. We're being left behind by other countries and other countries in technology that, a decade or two ago, considered, third world countries. There is no way that they'd be surpassing us technologically. And today we're finding that a lot of our jobs are going overseas, to some of these other countries. So maybe you're a parent or grandparent, a teacher or a mentor, a strategist, or maybe just care. But the fact is, kids in the U.S. aren't gaining the computer literacy they need to be competitive internationally and take us to the next generation where we're going technologically. Can everybody hear me in the back?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so to tell you a little bit about myself, I grew up, what I consider when I was growing up, middle class, but I grew up in Louisiana. So Louisiana is relatively a poor state, so probably my definition of middle class growing up was most people's definition of poor. But looking back on things, I wonder oftentimes if I had a lot more things to do, a lot more diversions, would I have programmed that with your computer? So when I was in third grade is when I first got introduced to computers. I was a Commodore 64 back then, and I kind of viewed the Commodore 64 as being something fun. The Apple II wasn't so much fun as things that you did work on. But when I was in 6th grade, I received a donated Apple II Plus computer. This was a computer that was destined for the garbage at a university. So fortunately, my grandmother grabbed it and sent it on to me. But what it meant was that this computer was really designed for business. It was intended for office use. It came with 2 pieces of software, VisiCalc and ScreenWriter. Not much fun when you're in 6th grade. Regardless of what grade you're in, it's probably not a lot of fun. There was no other software really with the computer itself. Certainly there were no games with it. So within the first few, days, day 1 or day 2, I was at the command prompt, making ASCII rocket ships and making them take off the screen just by holding down the return key. And a short time after that, I'm programming, making this ASCII rocket ship, do it over and over again, or neater effects. And this is probably a path a lot of kids took in the 80s, right? I mean, you got this computer, and what do you do with it? Well, the nice thing about the Apple II is right there, right when you boot the machine up, you've got a command prompt. You can write programs for it. So what a lot of people did, copied code by hand, wrote some games, and at some point had the ability to pirate some games as well. So that's all fun. Those were things that kind of got me started. And the other thing I wondered is whether or not the promise of games, right, is something that motivates a lot of people to start writing programs to begin with. If I had a large library of games, would I have even had the motivation to start programming to begin with? sure. But from that initial experimentation, I started doing things that actually mattered. So during middle school and high school, most of the, meaningful or accomplishments that I had were tied directly to the Apple II plus computer. And the nice thing that I felt at the time was that unlike a lot of other things in life, when you're programming, you're not limited by money or infrastructure or local resources. If you're doing certain pursuits like biology or something, you've got to have a lab at your disposal. You've got to have all this fancy, expensive equipment. And when you're programming, really, the only thing that's limiting you is how smart, is how well you can think about a problem, how creative you are, and your ingenuity. Whether or not you can actually solve whatever the problem is. So I created novel science fair projects. Later in high school, I used an Apple II computer wrote a program for our computer lab that timed reaction times and put together a project that ended up getting me a position in the Intel International Science and Engineering Fair, which, as a parent these days, looking at this with my own kids, my understanding now is if you get in the International Science and Engineering Fair as a kid today, you're almost guaranteed a scholarship whether you place or not. So, and that just came from having an Apple II Plus, or having a computer, learning how to program. Went on to win programming competitions. I had Sargon at some point. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. I think it was a really awesome chess game, but got fairly good at chess. And at a certain point, you can kind of see the background here. This is a screenshot of Scorched Earth. But a friend of mine had Scorched Earth on their PC, so I decided I'd write the same thing for the Apple II computer. And didn't realize it until I was in college, actually, that what I was doing was college-level physics in writing this game. So, the thing is, when you're writing programs and solving problems, you're not doing things because it's a hard problem. You're doing it because it's a fun problem to solve. And the kind of skills that you gain from doing that are relevant much later in life as well. So from fun that matters to fun that pays. So since learning BASIC on the Apple II computer, I've learned lots of other programming languages. But the point is really that based on that experience, I've gained skills that have been able to transition into my adult professional life. And I feel like it's a privilege to say that I love what I do. I don't think that it's unique in my industry for a lot of people to feel like they're really doing what they love. I consider my work fun. And for a lot of kids, being able to do something later in life that they consider fun, again, it is a unique opportunity, and it is a unique opportunity for computer science, computers in general. So today I write PHP code, consult delivery e-commerce solutions. It's thrilling, fun, and the pay isn't bad. And that's another point here, is that kids, if they don't have this background, are having a harder time finding jobs. Computers, computer skills, computer programming skills are becoming more and more ubiquitous across multiple industries. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you have the ability to write even basic computer programs, it gives you a huge advantage over other people in industries that you may not even have ever considered needing the skills of computer science. So what? I've really given you kind of my own personal anecdotes, my own personal story, but how does it matter in larger context? So, here's a question that we've been asking now for a while. Why is he taking your job? And he can be anyone in any country outside the U.S. Like I said earlier, we're losing more and more jobs to other countries. Now, if you're in the room, this talk really isn't about you, right? I mean, this is a talk that I'm wanting feedback on and a talk for you. It's a talk that I think a lot of people here can appreciate. This talk is about people who you'll impact, kids, successive generations, right? So, how do we avoid, what's going on? And originally, when I was learning about this problem of jobs being lost, right, or losing American jobs, I thought, well, it's obvious what companies are wanting to do, right? They're just finding cheaper labor outside the U.S. and outsourcing that labor, to other countries. And for a while, that was the case. It was fairly fashionable in the web industry, web development industry. And, for a while, it was very fashionable. Whatever your job was that you're looking for, just source it to India, source it to China. And there wasn't really a whole lot of thought. It was kind of a fashionable thing to do, whether it made sense or not. But what's happened since then is a lot of companies have realized, even though, the quote-unquote hourly pay is lower, there are liabilities associated with, sourcing jobs overseas. There's issues in terms of how efficient the coders are. There's issues as far as potentially having their valuable intellectual property stolen, especially in countries like China. So companies have really taken a step back, right, and said, okay, hang on, maybe we shouldn't be, outsourcing all this work, outside the U.S. Maybe we need to find some American programmers to do the work. Well, the reality is that you can't find enough American coders who can get the work done. And really, the eye opener for me, I read a lot of industry magazines, trade publications, was learning that for the highest end projects, the largest projects, the ones that pay the most, those projects never go to U.S. development shops. And the reason is U.S. development shops aren't large enough. They don't have the skills to even bid those jobs. Okay, so the most profitable work is never being seen inside the U.S. So, that to me is a large indicator that there's a larger problem besides just trying to find cheap labor. It's that we don't even have the skills anymore to be able to do the work that 21st century companies need done. So, what's going on? The U.S. really has blazed the trail in technology, right? I mean, we invented the Apple II. We've invented a lot of really neat things, really innovative pieces of technology. We've gotten better and better at making that technology readily available to the masses. But at the same time that we've made that technology readily available, I would argue that it started to kind of overwhelm us, right? So overwhelmed by the number of, videos that are available. Facebook, we spend so much time on Facebook. The iPhone kind of enables our constant connection to social media and all these diversions in our life that, for kids can really take away from their desire or time or motivation, to start coming up with kind of doing things for themselves. So something that I've heard a lot, my own mother has said it about my kids, is, wow, they can use an iPhone? And, so we'd like to look at kids and say, but they can use all this great technology. They've got all this technology that wasn't available to us when we were growing up. But really, so I went to this Texas Linux Fest, and one of the presenters, Jen Greenaway, made this observation that children who know how to drag and drop possess a valuable skill. Observation, right? Really, this is more a testament to Apple's engineering prowess, right, than it is the ingenuity of a 2-year-old. And it's important to start distinguishing between mastering the use of some technology and becoming a master of the technology itself. And I think that we tend to kind of mix up the two. So what's changed? I would argue that it's our relationship with technology, right? So going from an Apple II computer to the Macintosh, you really went from an open architecture, open infrastructure, a design to be hacked, right, to a closed machine, a machine that, if you did something as simple as swapped out the RAM on the machine, added new RAM, you voided your warranty. And this is kind of indicative of where our technology has gone in general. We've moved, Apple as a company, for example, has really moved from computers, personal computers, something that you use to extend your abilities, to appliances, right? They're designed, single-purpose design, maybe multi-purpose design, but it's a very carefully, narrowly defined set of things that you can do with that machine. I ended up going from an Apple II. I did end up upgrading to a Mac LC. I was really upset with John Sculley, I guess was at that time CEO of Apple. I can remember writing him a note, asking about the future of the Apple II series, and based on his response, realizing, the Apple II's dead. Apple's not supporting the Apple II anymore. And my family didn't have the discretionary income just to go out and buy, Apple II HES and a few years later buy a Mac, right? So, I ended up moving on to the Mac. But the fact that I had that prior experience programming was enough motivation to go out and spend, $200 for an IDE. I used to think C at that time. If I had never had that experience, being able to program at the command line, would I have spent $200 as a kid? Are you kidding? I mean, come on. The things that you could spend $200 on besides the way to program the machine. So today, a lot of technology is just like that. You never have the opportunity to even see the underlying parts of that technology. So our computers will do us in. The gut response, right, is I'm sorry. So the GUI has replaced the command line. A lot of people say that's a good thing. Google has replaced libraries again. A lot of people say that's a good thing. Tablets are replacing PCs. We rely on phones to remember things in our life. And, kids don't go outside to play anymore, right? They pull out the Xbox and whatever the latest gaming platform is. And that's how they spend their time. So that's not to say that any of this is bad, right? There are certainly good aspects to each of these. But at the same time, you have to look at what you're losing in the process. And if there's a way, if there's any negatives associated with that, and how you may be able to kind of swap out some of those negatives and replace them in other ways. Without that careful evaluation, I feel like we're headed towards losing the fundamental understanding of the technology that we live by. But yeah, right. This is the 21st century, right? This is awesome. We've got all this great technology available to us. It's crazy to say, that there might be some negative aspects of what we're exposing ourselves to. And, if you're like me, you base that on your own experiences, right? You grew up, you're perfectly fine. You're programming and enjoying, the latest and greatest technologies, right? You're enjoying the fact that you don't have to remember a phone number, in order to call your friend or but at the same time, for you and I, these latest advances in technology are relatively recent, right? 5-6 years, 10, depending upon how old you are, to 30% for life, has really been exposed to this latest technology. Current generations, 100% of their life is being exposed to this technology. Technology is so simple that even a 2-year-old knows how to use it, right? And so you have to really think, even though it's not necessarily a negative experience for you, you have all this other experience behind you the current generations just aren't getting with these latest technologies. And so we're already trailing other countries, right? And you know, the latest generations haven't arrived yet in the professional sense. You know, what's going to happen when they come out? And yes, they know how to use an iPhone, but not a whole lot beyond that. Okay, so when I look at technology, I don't look at it as just being technology. I view technology in different ways. I like to categorize technology. And I've come up with a few different slides for categorizing technology. One is empowering technology, and these are things like past computers like the Apple II, recent computers like the Raspberry Pi. They're open, they're accessible, they encourage understanding, and allow experimentation. You know, a lot of technology now just is a closed black box. It's designed to be that way. Then we have what I call replacement technology. So that includes things like self-driving cars, phones that auto-schedule our meetings, cameras that identify criminals. They're intended not to enhance the human being or the human experience or human capabilities. They're designed to replace humans, right? Just take them out of the equation. And then we have disabling technologies, which actively stifle our ability to accomplish some task. So examples that you're probably all familiar with include content scrambling system, commonly called CSS. Probably you're more familiar with DCSS. So this is how you used to have to play DVDs on Linux. Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, UEFI. This is common on the Mac, so you know if you use Macs, it may not be a big issue for you. But if you're on a Windows platform or PC, and you want to use Linux, this is a real impediment to using any operating system on your machine beyond Windows, content filters, etc. So one of the core issues I see being problematic is that too many of our technologies that we're introducing are the non-empowering kind. Modern technology is largely a black box. Some of this is unavoidable, obviously, due to the necessary complexity of advanced systems. But this also just means that we need to be more diligent in the effort to ensure modern computers don't simply become magic, right? Because magic isn't meant to be understood. And you know, we can't trust that our kids are going to somehow magically learn how these closed systems work. They're not. So one of the things that I ran across in my actual formal background, which is biology, something unrelated today, there's something called the Hygiene Hypothesis. So phrased a different way, you know, it's really whether or not kids' exposure to a very sterile, carefully crafted, closed technology is stifling their ability to understand that technology, right? I mean, when we were kids, you'd open up your machine, you know, you might solder things, you might blow up a chip, you know, go down to that hardware store, get a new chip, swap it in. You know, so kids today just they aren't getting their hands dirty. And you know, this is kind of the formal biological equivalent of the immune system. But you know, there may be something similar going on with our relationship with technology, kids' understanding of the technology. Because we're just not letting them get their hands dirty. Okay, so the solution to teach US kids to This is the propaganda portion of the talk.
When I first got access to a computer, my parents bought me a Macintosh in 1984 when I was 8 years old. I was in 6th grade.
I learned to code in college, freshman year, first semester, intro to computer science.
I wrote a
program to play tic-tac-toe.
I think it was pretty humble beginnings. I think the first program I wrote asked things like, what's your favorite color? Or how old are you?
I first learned how to make a green circle and a red square appear on the screen.
The first time I actually had something come up and say, hello world, and I made a computer do that. It was just astonishing.
Learning how to program didn't start off as wanting to learn all of computer science or trying to master this discipline or anything like that. It just started off because I wanted to do this one simple thing. I wanted to make something that was fun for myself and my sisters. And I wrote this little program and then basically just add a little bit to it. And then when I needed to learn something new, I looked it up, either in a book or on the internet, and then added a little bit to it.
It's really not unlike kind of playing an instrument or something, or playing a sport. It starts out being very intimidating, but you kind of get the hang of it over time.
Coding is something that can be learned, and I know it can be intimidating. A lot of things are intimidating, but what isn't?
A lot of the coding that people do is actually fairly simple. It's more about the process of breaking down problems than sort of coming up with complicated algorithms as people traditionally think about it.
You don't have to be a genius to know how to code. You need to be determined.
Addition, subtraction, that's about it.
You should probably know your multiplication tables.
You don't have to be a genius to code. Do you have to be a genius to read?
Even if you want to become a race car driver or play baseball, or build a house, all of these things have been turned upside down by software.
What it is computers are everywhere. You want to work in agriculture? Do you want to work in entertainment? Do you want to work in manufacturing? It's just all over.
Here we are, 2013. We all depend on technology to communicate, to bank, information, and none of us know how to read and write code.
When I was in school, I was in this after school group called the Whiz Kids, and when people found out, they laughed at me and all these things. And I'm like, man, I don't care. I think it's cool, and I'm learning a lot, and some of my friends have jobs.
Our policy is literally to hire as many talented engineers as we can find. The whole limit in the system is just that there just aren't enough people who are trained and have these skills today.
To get the very best people, we try to make the office as awesome as possible.
You're a fantastic chef.
Free food,
Breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
free laundry.
Snacks. Even places to play, and video games and scooters. There's all these kind of interesting things around the office, places where people can play or relax, or go to think, or play music, or be creative.
Whether you're trying to make a lot of money or whether you just want to change the world, computer programming is an incredibly empowering skill to learn.
I think if someone had told me that software is really about humanity, that it's really about helping people by using computer technology, it would have changed my outlook a lot earlier.
To be able to actually come up with an idea and then see it in your hands and then be able to press a button and have it be in millions of people's hands. I think we're the first generation in the world that's really ever had that kind of experience.
Just to think that you can start something in your college dorm room and you can have a set of people who haven't built a big company before come together and build something that 1 billion people use as part of their daily lives is just crazy to think about, right? It's humbling and it's amazing.
The programmers of tomorrow are the wizards of the future. You're going to look like you have magic powers compared to everybody else.
It's amazing. I think it's the closest thing we have to a superpower.
Great coders are today's rock stars. That's it.
So, welcome to my talk. Teaching us. So when I was programming Apple II, the programming reference was a small spiral-bound book, no more than a couple hundred pages. It may have been less than 100 pages. I don't remember exactly. But it was reasonable that you could memorize every single command, right, in AppleSoft Basic, or at least the important ones. Today, the sheer number of commands in modern languages are virtually impossible to memorize. There's literally thousands of commands, and within one particular application, if you're programming for the web, you might be using 3 different programming languages. So there's this huge barrier just in terms of understanding what's going on. At the same time, there's lots of example code already available on the internet. So today, when people say they're programmers or they program, oftentimes what it means is they're doing a lot of searching, copying, and pasting, right? They don't really truly understand the underlying mechanisms of the code that they're using. And so you can make the argument that this encourages best practices, right? In programming, it's all about code reuse. Why reinvent the wheel over and over again? But again, when we were growing up, if you had a problem, you just go on the internet and find the solution, right? You had to either come up with the solution yourself, or go through this long, drawn-out, painful process of trying to find someone else who might have encountered the same kind of problem. So, growing up, we actually had to kind of solve problems ourselves. I'm not the first person, obviously, who has recognized there's an issue. A lot of people have written languages, computer languages designed for kids. The problem with those is that they're typically dumbed down. They're not really designed for real-world use. So what that means, oftentimes, is one or two things. Either when this kid gets good enough in this particular programming language, and they face a real problem they have to solve. Language just isn't deep enough to be able to do it. It was really never designed. It was never tested in a production environment. Or the language ends up, being abandoned. It was written for, Windows XP, and for a particular classroom. Well, they just haven't updated the code for Windows 7, or Windows 8, or it was written for Mac OS 8, or whatever. There just isn't, that same motivation to keep that code up to date. So, kids end up, in a situation where they either got to jump 50 feet in the air, to get to where we are now with modern programming languages, or feel like they're being patronized. Some of these languages designed specifically for kids. Modern programming isn't fun. And in the old days, if you wanted to go on the internet and start hacking, you could do it with relative safety. That federal agents will come beating down your door, within hours. Today, it's a much more serious issue. People are using computers much more seriously today. There's e-commerce transactions flowing across the internet. So just exploring today, there's much more dire ramifications, right, for kids who might want to do the same things that you or I did as a kid. Additionally, the hardware we're using today is so much more complicated as well. So, engineers in the 80s might actually have had a pretty good understanding of every aspect of the hardware that they were working on. Today, if you're a developer, you can pretty much forget understanding every aspect of that hardware. If you understand some critical pieces, you're probably doing better than most developers. So all of these challenges can obviously seem a little overwhelming for kids. So how do you give kids a chance? So my first suggestion, and this is an option, I'm going to throw out a few different options for you to consider. And again, I'm looking for feedback here, but this is what I call the retro experience. So we already know a proven way for getting to the point where people are comfortable with and understand the technology of today, right? And that's through using the technology of the past. So we can get there with emulators and clone hardware. Of course, there's a lot of legal issues associated with that. And even if you want to avoid the legal issues and actually get the original hardware, there's only a limited amount of original hardware that you can get anyway. So looking at kind of the retro perspective, largely, you're looking in most cases at emulators, and that's not a big issue if you're looking at this for your own child, right? You can go out and download whatever disk images you want to. But if you're going to apply this kind of on a larger scale, the gray area is going to become a bigger legal liability. So it presents some challenges there. All right. So forget it, right? Forget the legal challenges. China does. If we did forget those for a minute, what would a reasonable architecture look like? A reasonable learning platform? And how would it respond to the inevitable criticism that what we're teaching is outdated and outmoded and of questionable relevance today? And the question I have is whether that's a valid criticism. Is this a valid approach to getting kids comfortable with where we are today? And how do you logically extend that? A kid has mastered, I don't know, Apple II, let's say. How do you turn around and use those skills in today's world and say, okay, you've learned a valuable skill that you can now apply to something bigger. For people who don't like approaching it from the retro perspective, you can stop babying your kids. Kind of throw them in the water with modern technology, modern computers, modern operating systems. And trust that your kid can figure out how to use the command line. You did, right? They can figure it out as well. So it's tempting to assume that the operating systems we use now, Windows, Mac OS, these really slick, polished interfaces that have evolved over decades, are also the best ones for our own kids. But we didn't use these operating systems growing up, right? Would you really have a great understanding of computers if someone had set you down in front of Mac OS and that's how you had learned to use the machine? So personally, if you don't want to do the retro experience, I'm a big fan of Linux. It's much easier to use today than it used to be, but it's not nearly as fun and easy as Windows or Mac OS is. But giving your kids the chance to suffer a little bit, I think would be a good thing. The other issue is that they'll have a wide assortment of free software without you having to be concerned that, again, police are going to come knocking down your doors because your kid has pirated some software they wanted to use. So, you and I growing up, probably we had free software too. But, free software like we had growing up is heavily frowned on these days. So, the other issue is that open source software is easily extensible. You can get access to the source code. Unlike commercial applications that you and I might use, if your kid masters that application, but they see some limitation with commercial software, there's nowhere for them to go. They can't extend that in any way. But with open source, they can. They can dig in. They can break the application. They can rebuild the application. It's all there for them to look at. So why stop there? You're going to make life difficult for your kids. You don't have to stop at the operating system. You can move on to the hardware. You can take away tablet. Tablet computers are designed for what? Consumption, right? It's designed to be passively, for the kids just have, not really kids, but for anyone, consumer, to passively sit there and watch the videos or, check their social status, social media status. And the other key with tablets is that any kind of input into the machine is cumbersome, right? I mean, even if you got the best virtual keyboard, it doesn't compare to the physical keyboard. You can restrict internet, or you can replace their laptop or desktop with something like the Pi, which comparatively is hugely underpowered, but realistically, the machine by our standards growing up is crazy, right? How much power is in this little $50 piece of machinery? The other advantage to doing something like that is computers are so fast now. It's hard to have an appreciation for good software, right? It's hard to appreciate the fact that someone's optimized memory usage or reduced CPU usage on a particular piece of software. When the machine's so powerful, it doesn't matter what you throw at it; it's still going to run decent. So giving them a slightly less powerful piece of machinery gives them a better appreciation for efficient memory and CPU utilization. And things like the Raspberry Pi that are open hardware, you can actually get all the specs behind the machine. The same way, that when I was growing up and you got an expansion card for your machine, typically the expansion card is really well documented. Today, if Linux developers are trying to add support for all these add-on cards, typically have to kind of reverse engineer the cards themselves because those specs just aren't there. So a machine like the Raspberry Pi, the specs are there. So your kid can become more than just a software hacker if they're interested. They can become a hardware hacker, like wasn't uncommon in the Apple II days. You can restrict internet access. I would argue that always-on internet access for your 5-year-old is not a requirement. I would argue a little bit further that it is actually a distraction, right? I mean, just as well as I do. For you and I, something as simple as YouTube. You can spend hours on YouTube, right? You're just looking at 3-minute videos, but they add up. And all these distractions associated with an always-on connection add up. And this isn't going to ruin our careers. Hopefully, if you're not doing this work, but it could really impact a kid's chances of number one being motivated to begin with to actually start programming or start using the machine in any kind of real, meaningful way. But it also takes away from their time to do that as well. And then we can limit distractions like games. And the approach that I've taken here is I told my oldest son, pretty soon there's going to be very specific time constraints on when you can play games, unless you write that game yourself. Any game you build yourself, you can play just as much as you want to. But I think that we can kind of reward behaviors that's beneficial, that promotes an understanding of technology and understanding of computers today. So, think like Steve. And this was here, I didn't know Steve Wozniak would be at this event. He was not in my presentation, so it doesn't matter anyway. But, a lot of people kind of look at Steve Jobs as, the epitome of great engineering. And certainly, Steve Jobs can build a killer appliance. But, Steve Wozniak will build a machine that people love to really use. So that's kind of another approach to this as well. If you're an engineer, if you're sitting in an engineering position, is more thoughtfully designing our products. So, love and trust the ingenuity of the user, provide tools that empower the user, make the product extensible, designed to enhance the user's ability, and consider the impact on kids. And, even though the Apple II, Steve Wozniak may have designed, especially, as I listened to him talk yesterday, realized, some of this that I've written here may be somewhat romanticized. I think that he built the Apple II largely for his own needs. But, at the same time, those same needs were the same ones that other people had as well. And they were things that other people would benefit from just the same way that he could benefit from his own creation. So, Apple II is a reference for that kind of hardware. People loved Apple II, not because it was beautiful to look at, or that it sounded great, or that it produced high-quality video, or that it was portable. But I would argue the degree to which it happened to empower the average individual is unparalleled, even to today. The other point, I don't think that my experience was unique. I think that it was a computer growing up that I was exposed to. It may have been, fairly indicative of the 80s experience in general as well. I think that there's a pressing need for kids to understand technology. And I've thrown out a few examples. We can accomplish it through retro experiences, open source, and/or more thoughtful engineering. Thank you. So does anyone have any questions, feedback?
And have you heard, are there any new long-term studies being started to look at kids who actually are growing up with 100% access to the new stuff, whether their trajectories would lead them to some of the, hands-on type of programming, and whether they can use old stuff and actually be productive, or if they just end up skipping that?
Well, I think it's just a matter of things being too new, right? We can kind of project where things might end up, but we don't really know yet at this point. It's kind of cell phones, right? For example, there's this big debate about whether or not they cause cancer. Well, we don't really know. We haven't had cell phones long enough. Who knows? Maybe kids who've been using cell phones from age 5, 50 years from now, we'll look back and say, wow, there really was a higher incidence rate of cancer. But this is the kind of thing where it's hard to see as it's happening, the long-term repercussions. There aren't these studies because it hasn't happened yet.
These are excellent recommendations for our own children in our own homes to set some sort of ground rules and foundation. That is first and foremost, in my opinion, where kids learn what is expected of them.
Sure.
But that's not the only place. It's not a vacuum. So when they go visit their friends' houses, when they go to different schools, and they see tablets and iPhones and all these other things, and they come home, how do you explain that discrepancy to them? Are they expected to be sheltered from that?
Sure. Okay, so, and I don't think that I mentioned, I grew up without a television in our household, okay? My mother, it wasn't religious reasons or anything. My mother just refused to have a television in the house. And, looking back as an adult, I think that I benefited greatly from that, right? But, so to answer your question, I went over to friends' houses who had television sets, and I came home and said, well, he has this great television, backlit, whatever, projection TV, 55-inch, I don't care, you get little contest entry forms, win a small black and white television, enter the contest, and my mother would say, I don't care, if you win, it's not coming in the house. So yes, I was exposed to things beyond, what I had available in my own house. My friend had an Atari, a computer he just plugged the games into. That was a novelty, that I didn't have in 6th grade and 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade when he had that as well. So, certainly they're going to be exposed to it, right? And it's not to say that they can't use it when they're at their friend's house, or they can't kind of see how it works. But as a parent, you can certainly say, not in my household. Yeah, sure. Your friend John has got, the whatever, Xbox, and, he plays it 24 hours a day. That's the rules for his household, but not in mine. And so as a parent, that's my position.
Thank you. I'm not a parent, but I am an educator. This is fascinating.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm curious what you think about the pros and cons of exposing, let's say, I don't even know what age you'd want to start at, but something that is young person focused like an OLPC, or even like you're saying the Raspberry Pi, that's something that's limited in function and scope, versus just giving them something that is the same as Daddy uses. My son loves to play on my iPad, and when I use it, there's his apps right next to my apps, and he knows which ones he likes to play. But I'm thinking about getting him one of the new OLPC tablets because it's more oriented to young people and education and hopefully more creation than consumption. I just wanted to see what your thoughts are on something that's specifically that focus versus more of the what he's going to see if you went to like a restaurant.
So actually, it's a OLPC. Was a long delay project. Their intention was to get $100 was the price point. And it took them years to develop that machine. And it was again, someone came up with the idea of what third world countries would need for a cheap computer, right? It was never proven in any kind of environment. And since then, things like the Raspberry Pi, are cheaper than the OLPC, right? Consumes very little electricity. It can easily be hooked up to a solar panel or wind power, whatever. So I think that things like the OLPC are highly artificial environments, kind of like I was alluding to with the programming languages. So a conversation I had a couple of years ago with Jeff was not in the room, but is it worth designing an entirely new, unproven computer to do this, or can we give third world developing countries, an Apple II clone, a cheap Apple II clone, an Apple II emulator? It's got all the software that's ever written. Is that of value? Absolutely. How many man hours were invested in business software that's developed in Apple II? Just because it might not be as high resolution as what we're accustomed to today, doesn't mean it's any less worthwhile. So to answer your question, in that position, I kind of look at things that have a proven track record, right? So not just OLPC, but can I give them an emulated computer or an old computer that is already proven, right? To kind of, I personally have gotten into this mindset because I had an Apple II computer, right? With these particular applications on it. Whereas with OLPC, not only do you have to hope that your kid can use the machine, but you've got to learn how to use the machine as well, right? Whereas if it's a machine that you used when you were a kid, you already know how to use it. You know what it can and can't do. You know what some of the stumbling blocks are. You kind of help them through that experience the way that you can if it's new hardware that you're just not familiar with.
Okay. Thank you.
But I come from Australia and we have the same sort of issues and concerns down there. People grew up with the same background that you've got. So kids just aren't getting into technology. So what can we do about it? And I think what you're talking about today is fascinating. But I also wonder whether there's some other perspectives, non-technology perspectives we need to think about. When I was 15 and I was fooling around with computers, you had the lid off them, you had the solder iron out, and you did the best you could to not break things, but as you said, if you broke them, you generally fix them or get them fixed reasonably cheaply. But really, that wasn't what drove me into doing it. What was fun was you could write that tic-tac-toe program, where you could write a program that would just generate random numbers and pretend you were conducting a lottery, or get numbers to put in a lottery form, or do the rocket ship example. They were simple things to do and they were reasonably entertaining. But by today's standards, it's lame.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think the challenge is that the threshold of knowledge that you need to get to do something as a kid that's now not lame by modern entertainment standards is so high that there's a much higher talent requirement to get there. So that you can still write the tic-tac-toe program, but no one's going to be entertained by it for very long. And to go to the next level is then being quantum leap. Right. So I think that's one of the problems. And I think maybe the way to overcome that is to stay, not think like I do, in that way, to say, well, what do kids value? What would drive a kid to want to turn this thing on and play with an experiment? And I don't know what the answer to that is because I don't come from psychology background. But I think that's an element of it that's not covered yet.
Sure, I agree, absolutely. And so, and actually I have a case that might be relevant to the question as well. So my oldest son, 7 years old, we just enrolled him in a computer gaming class where you learn how to write computer games. So, this is a rapid application, program that they give the kids, and so the kids learn how to write like, basic, either side scroller or, all on the same screen, kind of arcade game. It's basic. And, maybe it conflicts with, my feelings about developing these artificial languages. But, in the gaming industry, everyone who goes out to write a game doesn't start with machine language, right? I mean, generally there's already a platform there. There's a rendering engine there that they pull from. So my perspective in this case is if he starts along those lines, at some point he's going to reach the logical limits of what that software can do, right? And you would hope at that point he'd have enough of an interest to say, well, how can I go beyond the software limitation? What's the next step? Can I use something more sophisticated, or can I start writing code myself that actually does some of these things? So that's one nebulous kind of approach that you're talking about. But certainly it is. It's a very complicated issue. And,
I think also, I'm not too tough on kids in this respect, because I also think about, well, take the analogy outside of computers, think about cars, for example. When I was 18, I knew how to fix my, and I did fucking program. Sheer economics of the situation, you learn how to fix it. Today I don't fix my own car. I can't get access to the computer codes, I don't know what's going on with the car. Parts are very, deals make it very difficult to get access to parts and manuals. So I've lost that skill set myself. So just as I've lost that skill set, it's a bit hard to criticise kids when I want to get the skill set in another area. So some of it's, I think the answers are difficult.
they are absolutely. You have to weigh whether or not that skill set that you learned, and even though you can't fix your car today, still having kind of an understanding of what might be going on, how valuable that is as well. Anything else?
In 1991 or so, a friend of mine was going to Cal Poly taking computer science, and this was the beginning of what I figured was the megahertz explosion. Led us up to gigahertz and whatnot. He was taking a C class. If you remember back end of the 2GS era, 65A16 programmers were in demand for like Super Nintendo.
Sure.
They knew how to program a 2GS. Because everybody knew that if you could program a 2GS well, you knew how to program versus you know how to slop it out. So he was telling me that the teachers at Cal Poly were saying CPU and RAM are going to be cheap. Don't worry about it. And look what we've got.
That's right. Sure. They are. They're very cheap. At the same time, we're overlooking some opportunities here as well. So I mean, if you look at like the latest Intel processors, right? I mean, on the CPU die itself, you've got more memory than what was on the original Apple II computer, right? I mean, we could be writing computers that machines that actually run on the CPU die, if we were so inclined. Today we like to use fancy, IDEs that build these monstrous applications for us. But if you have some of that background as well, you can kind of think about things from a different perspective too. Is that it?
I'll throw it in. Sorry, I gotta remember. I wouldn't personally get too caught up in CPU cycles and RAM and all that. And that's just my personal opinion. Programming is programming. I mean, I work on computers, I work on very expensive to process hundreds of millions of records in a minute or less. And yeah, efficiency is still important because I'm working on hundreds of millions of records.
That's right.
In the end, the problems, as the hardware gets bigger, the problems get bigger. But the problems that people want to solve get bigger. And there are problems that we have at work now that we would like to solve, that we can't. But if you could make the processor 10 times faster, we would attack them. So I think there will always, just that, I think the problem that I have is that some of the people I work with can break large, complicated problems down into small. I mean, it's sort of a top-down methodology. But whether you're talking waterfall or anything, I'm not going to get into that. But you can think logically. If you can take something very complicated and organize it into processes, that, in my opinion, is the difference between someone that has a programming experience and not a programming experience.
Sure.
And to dovetail into the video, even if you're not going to be a programmer, having that process in your head where you can think logically about things and break complicated things down into smaller, easier to understand ideas. That might help you run a business, even if you never write a program again. So that's kind of my thought.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the non-technical side, you know, when I was in high school, we had to learn, you know, theorems and proofs, how to make proofs, right, in geometry, I guess it was, you know, in high school. And that's something that's not really promoted too much today either, right? But that teaches you a huge skill, a valuable skill, to be able to think about problem logic. So, anyway, thank you all. I am open if you want to talk about the matter any further, we can do so at dinner or any time during the conference or afterwards. It's fun with me. Thanks.